Comic Geek Speak presents Murd's Time Bubble, the 29th time. Welcome aboard the Time Bubble, your trendsetter in trans-temporal infotainment. I'm Adam Murdo, Captain, Commodore, Quartermaster, Concierge, and Master of Ceremonies for the Chrono Cruise that now ensues, during which you will experience like-new reviews of comic books from the early 2000s or earlier. And I hope that's something you're into, because when you tune into this podcast, that's all you're going to get. Well, that and personal anecdotes and reminiscences, historical sidebars, free association of concepts, shaggy dog stories, the usual value-added shtick, basically. Probably most of you listening to me blather on here I've listened to the Time Bubble before, and you presumably know what you're in for and keep coming back because you enjoy it. So here's hoping you enjoy what I've got for you this time out. And let me tell you, folks, my linear lads and lasses, you know how fond I am of employing hokey vehicular and nautical metaphors to describe what I do here on this spin-off podcast I do. And I gotta say that recently it seems like the most apt of these metaphors is emergency vehicle, because it seems I can only force myself to make the time to record a time bubble nowadays if there's some kind of emergency gap forming in the Comic Geek Speak recording schedule. This episode to which you're now listening was actually supposed to happen back in August, when Pants, our de facto producer for Comic Geek Speak, was on vacation in London for the London Super Comic Con, and I believe a couple of the other guys were also unavailable owing to family commitments, running around doing last-minute end-of-summer before school starts stuff. So I was supposed to step in and save the day there, but, however, time would not allow. It was, after all, still August, the busy summer season. Things were still hopping here in Stone Harbor, and work just would not allow me to get away and record a time bubble at that time. So I've had to sort of shelve this episode. All the notes had been taken and everything, but I'm just now getting around to doing it because, once again, a lacuna has developed in our recording schedule. Shane is unavailable due to fatherly responsibilities. Chris, ditto, plus he's still working to dismantle his business, and I hope all of you join me in sending out my thoughts and sympathies to him as Wild Pig Comics lays itself down to rest once again. Hopefully not for the last time. After all this, Wild Pig seems to have more lives than a cat, honestly. It's been gone before. Chris thinks this will be the last time, and well, if that's the way it must be, that's the way it must be. But whatever transpires in the future, we all wish Chris and the Wild Pig family the best. But as he takes a little time away from the show to address all of that, that creates, as I said, the dreaded gap in the recording schedule. And so here I come in my emergency vehicle time bubble, yes. Podcast killed the radio star, In my time bubble, the emergency sirens screaming across the time stream to provide emergency transport for all of you distressed podcast listeners to help ferry you across the time gap between last week and next week, when hopefully another regular Comic Geek Speak episode will be available for your listening pleasure. But in the meantime, just enjoy your complimentary warm blankets and cocoa, and expect the signature service that you'd get on one of our luxury trans-temporal cruises here aboard Murd's Time Bubble. Whether this is a luxury liner or a smuggler's vessel, I still don't know. My metaphors are so badly mixed, or muddled, if you will, that they have no hope of actually making linear sense. But who cares? It's all fake anyway. This is just a podcast where I talk about back issues, so why don't we get down to doing exactly that, speaking of. Yeah, so for this episode of the Time Bubble, I have another handful of comics from late 2001. I'll probably still be in that year for several episodes to come. Several comic books that are cover dated in or around, most of them are cover dated November of 2001, which means that they would have been released in that fateful, tragic month, September of 2001. Sad, dark times for our nation, for the United States of America, remembering that not everyone listening to this is going to be an American citizen, of course. But yes, September of 2001, I think I'm going to hold off for the future any discussion of what September 11th, 2001 was for me. My personal experience of the day, which is really come down to it, not all that interesting or important. Suffice to say for the time being that I was in college, albeit just barely, in the fall of 2001, and I still to this day am very grateful for having been in that environment at the time that national tragedy struck. And I'll go on to say, I'll come back to September 11th when I get around to talking about that well-remembered issue of J. Michael Straczynski and John Romita Jr.'s Amazing Spider-Man run, the one with the all-black cover, which was all about how the denizens of the Marvel Universe, Spider-Man in particular, responded to the September 11th attacks. Which I certainly will when the time is ripe. So I'll throw in a few personal reminiscences at that point. But for now, suffice to say, I was in college, and on a less personal note and still relevant, comics. These comics I'm going to talk about here, and probably some of the ones that I'll be talking about in a few future episodes, in all likelihood, came into my possession a little later than they were originally scheduled to, since after all, they're among one of the far lesser and less tragic and serious consequences of that fateful day was the result was late shipping books. Since, as if I'm recalling correctly, September 11th, 2001 did fall on a Tuesday. So New Comic Wednesday for that week, and I'm pretty sure the week after as well, was affected. Plus, comics that were in production for a couple of months to come, I would think, were influenced in one way or another in terms of timeliness. Because, well, remember, after 9/11, like, air traffic all over the country was grounded for days. Thousands of American travelers across the nation and the world were stranded in various places. And, of course, the shipping infrastructure was thrown into complete chaos. Here's a little anecdote I will share. In the fall of 2001, early September, I was watching a lot of TNN, which still existed in those days, and I think was still called the Nashville Network before it transitioned briefly to the National Network and then emerged from its cocoon as Spike TV, television for men. But it was showing reruns of Taxi and WKRP in Cincinnati, Star Trek TNG, and so I was watching a lot of that during my final semester at Penn State. And advertised during those programs, was one of those audio compilations of popular music that used to be on TV a lot in days gone by. It was called Easy Rock. 2 cassettes for $7.99 or 2 CDs for $14.99. It was basically late 70s, early 80s, mellow, like FM rock sounds, like the Doobie Brothers. This Is It by Kenny Loggins, Reminiscing by the Little River Band, etc. I actually ordered the cassette version of that Easy Rock compilation and didn't receive it for weeks. Finally, I broke down and called, I think it was Music Space that put this compilation together. It was music that was on the Warner Brothers label, but put together and marketed by Music Space. I called their telemarketing center and spoke to a nice lady and inquired as to the status of my order, and she checked her computer and found that sure enough, it had been all ready to ship, but it went out, or was scheduled to go out, on September 11th, 2001, from a warehouse somewhere in the American Southwest, and no surprise that it never reached its destination. So she was nice enough to just put in another order for me at no additional charge, and within a couple of days I had my Easy Rock cassettes. Listened to them over and over again in my old Volvo wagon, and in point of fact, I still have them to this very day. They're in one of my dresser drawers here in Stone Harbor, where I still have a clock radio with a cassette deck. Anyway, this long story, I mentioned there'd be Shaggy Dog stories, didn't I? This is just truth in advertising. This is all just as kind of a personal anecdote to illustrate how badly shipping was thrown off by the 9/11 attacks. And so that certainly affected new comic book days for a couple of weeks and the production of new comics for a couple of months, because undoubtedly it would have made it difficult for pages of comics art to be shipped from member to member of the creative team, or to get from artist to editor, for example, or from editor to printer. So, yes, it's among the far, far lesser consequences of all of that was the impact it had on the comics economy. So with that in mind, let's move on to a comic that premiered, actually, this is one of the few I have that has a cover date of October of 2001, so it actually began in August of 2001 and ran through, those dark, bleak events. And but the tone of the thing is somewhat appropriate to the quasi-surreal murk and moil and emotional devastation that a lot of us experienced at about that same time. So kind of an appropriate read for what was going on at the time. I mean, entirely by accident, of course, since the entire thing, I'm sure, was finished by the time September 11th, 2001 rolled around, although it continued to be published for like 2 months afterwards. So cover dated through October of 2001 through January of 2002, I believe it would be. You see, it's a 4-issue miniseries. It's a product of the then red-hot Marvel Knights imprint, and also the fruit of the labor of Grant Morrison, who did produce only a handful of works for Marvel Comics. There was, of course, the Marvel Boy miniseries, which is also through Marvel Knights. There's the controversial, call it, new X-Men run that he did. There's Skrull Kill Crew from back in the 90s. People tend to forget that one. And there were... and of course, I'm sure there's some Whovians out there who are just on tenterhooks to see if I'll remember to mention this, but he also wrote a bunch of Doctor Who stories for Marvel UK far back near the beginning of his career. But what I'm talking about in this instance is a 4-issue miniseries entitled Fantastic Four 1, 2, 3, 4. So, of course, it's a 4-issue miniseries. What else? I actually have all 4 of the issues here with me. I decided, instead of just focusing on issue number 1, as I tend to do when I do these little pellet reviews for the Time Bubble, I'd just kind of lump all 1, 2, 3, 4 issues together and do kind of a gloss of the whole thing. The work as a whole, if you will. So, yes, it's a bit of Grant Morrison fun here. With art by Jay Lee and colors by Jose Villarrubia. And as an additional bit of Marvel fun trivia here, the second 2, issues 3 and 4, let's just say, actually carry the Marvel PG content rating. So those would have been comics that were published in October and November of 2001. That's apparently is when Marvel began its self-imposed content rating system, in case you were curious. And issue number 4 bears down in the lower right-hand corner the little corner bug of the front cover that it is an image of the a silhouette of the New York skyline with the twin World Trade Center towers on it, and a big red, white, and blue striped memorial ribbon in the background. It's a little something that the covers of every Marvel comic published for many months carried there back in 2001 and into 2002. Oh, and speaking of covers, Jay Lee also provides them for the 4 issues of Fantastic Four 1, 2, 3, 4. Pretty spiffy looking. Okay, so getting down to the story inside. The scene is set fairly early in issue 1. I think it's page 4, right after a little introductory few pages of Ben Grimm yelling at some policemen. His tempers are high, and soon we discover, as the stage is set, that he's not the only one. And Morrison employs a classic device. Yeah, and the mere fact that Morrison is doing something and telling a story that can be described as a classic device gives you the idea that this might not be Morrison at his most innovative. But yes, a classic device of a voiceover caption of a newsreader reporting on weather conditions in New York City. It's a very hot summer day in Fantastic Four's New York. Temperatures over 101 degrees, high humidity. Hurricane Stanley, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, is looming offshore. And what's behind all this weather? Is it global warming? Or, quote, can we pin it on the Atlanteans? So you see xenophobia, paranoia, the tensions are running as high as the humidity, and certainly the Fantastic Four are not immune. There's just something, the indications that there's literally something unnatural in the air, that there's some sinister external force, even, that's just bringing out the worst in the Fantastic Four, as we see scenes of them quarreling with one another, more or less as per usual, but a little worse than usual, in the Baxter Building. It's bringing out the worst in them and also a few of their enemies, as we'll see, and setting them at each other's throats. So yes, the tensions are quite high, and the reader is left to wonder just what exactly is causing all of this. Is it Doom, who does turn out to be one of the... well, he's present in this story in a big way. Whether he's actually the motivating factor, whether he's actually as much in control of events as he thinks he is, very much in doubt. But then whatever's going on with the FF, he's not immune to it himself, as we'll see. It seems just as likely that it's going to turn out to be Grant Morrison himself. I wouldn't have been surprised if the story had ended by the camera pulling back and showing Morrison sitting there at his writing desk by his typewriter, smirking up at the camera and saying, "Ain't I a stinker?" Bugs Bunny duck-a-muck style. That's absolutely not the way this 4-issue miniseries ends, but it's basically what Morrison did with his Animal Man run, so it wouldn't have been out of place, but he didn't go in that direction. But yeah, so he could implicitly be the mysterious supernatural force that's getting everybody... throwing everybody into conflict with one another here. But we'll return to that a little later on. So anyway, the Doom. Yes, the Doom is... he is a factor of sorts here. The whole story, plot-wise, the story might as well be called Dr. Doom's Four-Way Revenge, with apologies to Denny O'Neil, who wrote a Batman story, a famous one called The Joker's Five-Way Revenge back in the 70s. And so it's a 4-part miniseries, of course, and Doom has basically decided that he's, quote, tired of it all, and he's put together this ultimate revenge scheme to put the Fantastic Four out of his misery once and for all, motivated by nothing in particular. So he works up this strategy, and he fancies himself the prime mover of this whole scheme. And in fact, here's a little side note, another cool bit of comics trivia here for you. Morrison resurrects a classic... concept from the Silver Age of the Fantastic Four, the Prime Mover, which is this alien robot that Doom salvages from a crashed spaceship and modifies to serve as kind of a tactical engine for him. It generates strategies for him for dealing with his enemies, and also allows him to test those strategies and also keep himself mentally sharp by playing little strategical games with him, which sometimes involve real people as playing pieces, and that's certainly the case in this story. Except in this story, he's souped up the Prime Mover to the point that it can actually alter reality in the course of the little game that Doom is playing. And that's how he sees it. It's each of these 4 issues represents a move in this deadly game that Doom thinks he's playing. Each issue puts kind of a loose focus or emphasis on one member of the Fantastic Four, digging into his or her agitated psyche as he or she falls prey to whatever tailor-made designer doom that Doom has prepared for him or her. They're just game pieces falling in sequence in Doom's game. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is how Doom is looking at it. The whole scheme turns on Doom's restlessness and impatience as much as his hatred, it seems. I mean, he does, and I quote, claim to be, quote, tired of it all. He mentions this in conversation with one of his targets, Ben Grimm, in the first issue, the one that he probably thinks of as the smallest threat, so he doesn't mind revealing a few bits of his scheme to him, even as he suckers Ben into playing his part in Doom's grand design. But so he's bored and tired, and he contrives this whole revenge scheme on a whim. Doom's whims are famously elaborate, and he's just in general acting like a bored, petulant child, playing extra rough with his toys while he's stuck inside on a rainy day, or an extra hot day. So, or maybe an even better metaphor would be like a bored, petulant child who, stuck inside on a rainy day, forces his brothers and sisters, cousins, whatever other kids are stuck in the house with him at the time, forces them to play a board game with him and cheats. Either way, the puerility of his behavior is... I mean, it occurred to me even as the story is beginning, and by the end of the story, it's kind of been borne out. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, Doom, whatever it is that's getting the rest of the FF hot under the collar, it's affecting him too. And so he embarks on this little 4-part scheme of his. And the real in the end, he's safely outplayed by Reed Richards. But Reed, he really is completely absent from the narrative until the very end of the third issue, and then he comes in and does his usual super science Deus Ex Machina shtick in the fourth issue, outplays Doom in grand fashion, with a little help from his family, of course. So that number 4 is definitely Reed's issue. Number 1 belongs to Ben Grimm, and the two in the middle, number 2 is Sue, the Invisible Woman, and number 3 nominally belongs to the Human Torch. So then that's how it breaks down. At its heart, this is really not an exceptional Fantastic Four story. It is certainly not in terms of plot, and certainly not given that Grant Morrison is the one writing it. I mean, it's just it lacks. Well, it doesn't entirely lack the usual Morrisonian neophilia. He's not really inventing any wheels here. There's certain touches, little flourishes of the super science that Doom employs in bringing the FF down, and also in the super science with which Reed responds in the final issue. But on the whole, it's not even. You would sort of expect Morrison to get into the whole cosmic adventure and exploration angle of the FF, but instead he gives us what's basically it's just your basic villain's vendetta yarn. And it doesn't take the FF in any exciting new places, literally or conceptually. It's just it's entirely set in, around, and beneath New York City, with the exception of one or two quick aside scenes where we cut over to Doom in Latveria. It's really, in terms of FF innovation and exploration, it's outshone by some of the things that the team of what I like to call M2W2, that would be Mark Waid and Mike Waringo, would do a couple of years later. In particular, the Unthinkable arc, which is basically Doom going about doing exactly what he's doing in this miniseries, taking down the FF one at a time, once and for all, using newly acquired sorceress powers. Just read that story. It actually, in its way, it's better than this miniseries. But this series has some things to recommend it too, as I'll elucidate on a little bit later on. But yeah, it doesn't quite live up to the edgy reputation of either Morrison or the Marvel Knights imprint, I would argue. It's kind of just a token opportunity for Morrison to, do like Doom and play with the classic early Fantastic Four toys himself. There's certain soap opera elements to it, really. The plot is, but that's not the reason to read this miniseries. Let me go ahead and say it. Morrison sort of chose, perhaps curiously, to forego the idea of expanding cosmic frontiers with the FF, as only he can, and instead he decided to do what I guess would be the unexpected thing for him, and that's just to do a more or less quiet little Morrisonian monograph on the Fantastic Four's family dynamic. He went for character instead, and it is a fairly decent character study of most of the characters involved here, the FF and a few of their classic foes, not only Doom, but some other pawns that he hooks into his game here, Namor and the Mole Man. So it's Morrison playing with not only the FF, but a few of their greatest and earliest enemies of the Silver Age. And it overturns a couple of aspects of their character that probably had been present, but not the most visible. It reveals a couple of interesting new sides or wrinkles to them. So he's doing his work there as a writer, to be sure. Of course, I had been all set to say that there are some of the characters that he portrays and delves into a little better and a little deeper, respectively, than others. I'd been all set to come out and swinging and say that he's not too good to Sue, the Invisible Woman, for example. But on rereading what he does with Sue in this miniseries, I've kind of changed my tune. He actually does, he gives her a pretty fair shake. I mean, she was established in the Byrne run as the most powerful of the Fantastic Four, and she really barely gets to use her powers at all in this miniseries. She makes a couple of force field bubbles in the fourth issue. But I've sort of rethought my position here and decided that the measure of a strong female character need not depend the extent to which she's running around snarling and punching people in the face. And Sue actually does get her licks in. I mean, in the fourth issue, when Reed, he spends most of this miniseries lost in a cogitative coma of sorts. Before the first issue even begins, he's figured out what Doom is up to. He sort of senses the influence of the prime mover robot in the air, and he just puts himself into seclusion and is literally brainstorming. I mean, there's like a miniature electrical storm going on in that malleable, cosmically irradiated superbrain of his. He spends the first 3 issues just thinking up counter strategies. Meanwhile, poor Sue just thinks that Dorit is ignoring her as usual, and she spends the entire second issue. This is the one that's supposed to be devoted to her. She goes over to Alicia Masters' loft, her atelier, her little artist studio where she's little. It's huge. It's one of the most impossible things in this miniseries, with all the cosmic powers and giant robots flying around, is the size of Alicia Masters' loft and the idea that a sculptress can afford to live in such conditions. But anyway, Sue goes over there, and the two of them share wine and Thai food and talk about Reed and Namor and guys. And there's something to be said for this scene. I mean, there's some good character moments, especially for Alicia. I mean, even if Morrison, as I initially thought, does a discredit to Sue or some of the other characters, Alicia, by contrast, comes off looking great. Wise, skilled, capable, at peace, totally comfortable with herself, not mooning over or pining for anyone or anything for once. She's really the only completely level head in the entire story. Plus, her studio, her statuary and her little puppet things. She's the daughter of the puppet master, after all, so she has access to his radioactive clay, which can affect reality in its own way, not unlike the prime mover, hint, hint. The statues and the puppets are ever-present sources of symbolism and foreshadowing. So it's nice that Alicia's here and that she's used to such good effect. But she's there as kind of a sounding board for Sue, as the two of them sit there in issue 2 and just dish. And Sue spends the entire time invisible. And there's something to that. I mean, other writers have attested that invisibility is actually Sue's natural state. And it requires concentration on her part to make herself visible. Some other writers tend to forget that. But Morrison may be aware of that, maybe no. So she shows up at Alicia's place, and since Alicia's blind anyway, it could be taken as Sue just letting her hair down and being natural, totally herself, by being literally transparent for the entire time that she's with her girlfriend, Alicia. Could also be seen as kind of a weird, cruel prank against Alicia, who can't see, and might also be seen as somewhat self-negating or a sign of poor self-esteem on Sue's part. It's kind of ambiguous. But really, the problem I had with that issue was that it was just so darned Lifetime Channel, and besides which it totally fails the Bechdel test, because all the two of them do is sit there and talk about guys. They're talking about Reed and, how he tends to ignore her and retreat into his own mind, and Alicia reassures her that every time he does that, Sue's love is the spark that makes his ideation possible. And, of course, they talk about the other man, Namor. And so, yeah, there's that. It would have been nice if they could have come up with some other things to talk about during that scene. But Sue gets her good licks in the end, because when Reed finally does come back, reassures everyone that he's just been planning to defeat Doom, and that he does love them all and value them all, and that they're all crucial to his life and happiness and all of that. Yeah, he's the one who outplays Doom for the most part, but it's Sue who travels to Latveria via teleportation, and when Doom is already sputtering and fuming in impotent rage at what Richards has done to him, Sue invisibly lands the final punch to him and basically tells him, "Do shut up." And the most devastating thing she does to him isn't even the punch that she lands, it's the severe talking to that she gives him afterwards. Sue scolds Dr. Doom into submission. It's like Morrison is trying to show us a balance of different kinds of strength, each of them perfectly valid, it should be mentioned, in Sue Richards. Some people are wont to say if she's not out there, as I said, snarling and punching, she's not showing herself to be on an equal plane strength-wise with the male characters. Not necessarily so. Morrison wants to make sure we see that her strength is a blend and a balance of the martial and the maternal. Sue is a mother, and that is a proponent source of strength for her, and no freaking reason why it should be seen as anything other than that. But she gives Doom the business, accusing him of being childish, a grown man playing with toys, which sort of bore out my own observation about Doom being a bored, vicious little kid abusing his toys while stuck inside on a rainy day, and just reprimanding him for just wasting his time on silly revenge schemes like this one, which are such a titanic waste of everyone's time. That's a near quote and perhaps a meta comment by Morrison on the relative value of his own work in this miniseries. And then when he should be curing cancer or taking Latveria to the stars, that's the most devastating blow Doom suffers in the whole miniseries, I think it's safe to say. And then Sue just kind of sniffs the air and gathers up Ben Grimm and leaves. She brought Ben along to cure him of the special doom that Dr. Doom had contrived for him, which was winding him back, promising him a cure for his thing condition. He wound Ben back in time, leaving him stuck, sort of brain-addled as his young human self plucked from time from just before the FF went up in that rocket that changed all their lives, and then teleports him back to New York and plops him right down on Yancey Street. His memory's all tissy, and he's badly disoriented, and what do you know, the first thing happens, he gets hit by a car, and he needs to have his arm amputated. He spends most of the miniseries lying around in a daze in a veterans hospital somewhere nearby. But Sue comes after him and gives him the help and the cure that he needs. A further note about number 2, and this is one of my little weird continuity conspiracy tangents that I go off on sometimes. The title of the second issue, Sue's issue, is Staring at the Fish Tank. Okay, and that's on the surface probably intended to be a reference to Sue's ongoing infatuation with Namor, and that's actually the doom that Dr. Doom cooks up for her. It's a love trap. Doom. One of the main reasons why Doom's little schemes fail in this story is that he fails to understand the Fantastic Four as people, and therefore his equation for defeating the Fantastic Four balances his own, it sort of gambles that his own capacity for learning and mastery of knowledge and skills is greater than what he'll never learn or understand, and that's love, family, togetherness. Much like Voldemort and many other classic villains of popular culture, he just does not understand love and friendship, and that proves his downfall in the end. So, because he doesn't understand the FF as people and the special bonds they share as a family, he is completely wrong in his hypothesis that they'll be able to be ensnared and brought low by their own base desires. And what he had in mind for Sue was that she could be coaxed away by offering Namor as bait, and leave it to a fish man to highly resent being used as bait, let me tell you. Bump. So anyway, staring at the fish tank, I've convinced myself. The first thing I thought when I saw that title and knew that it applied to a story about Sue was, believe it or not, what if Volume 2, number 11. Okay, this is the 90s series of the Marvel comic What If, which presents hypothetical scenarios about what might have happened if certain events in the Marvel Universe and its history went differently than they did. And issue number 11 asked the question, and answered it in 4 different stories, what if the Fantastic Four had all gotten the same power? So we had stories featuring 4 stretchy people, 4 invisible people, 4 human torches, and 4 things. And in the 4 things story, you had Johnny Storm with that tough dinosaur hide that Ben Grimm originally had in Fantastic Four number 1, Ben Grimm with the rocky hide that he would acquire later in mainstream Marvel history. Reed Richards becomes the Brute, which is a form that the Reed Richards of the High Evolutionaries Counter-Earth took at one time. From Marvel history buffs there, that's a deep cut. And Sue became a version of the Man-Thing. And most tragically of all, her human intellect was completely wiped away. She showed no sign of sentience. She's just like the Man-Thing himself. And there is a quickie scene, one panel of the Fantastic Four, Sue, Johnny, and Ben hanging around the Baxter building, waiting for Reed to cobble together a flight craft to take them all to Monster Island, where they'll all live out the rest of their days in exile. But there is in that panel, you see Sue as the Man-Thing standing there and staring into a fish tank, fascinated by the little fishies swimming around in it. So I have no idea whether or not Morrison has ever read that comic or whether that panel struck him. I mean, this is something that I read ages ago in the early 90s when my friend Matt of Comic Geek Speak and I were Boy Scouts together at Scout Camp. It's a comic that he brought with him to read in our tent, and he let me borrow it, and that image somehow of Sue as the Man-Thing standing there and staring into the aquarium has stuck with me all these years. I don't know at all if Morrison is aware of that, but I like to tell myself that he did, and it was just kind of a very heavily veiled wink to those of us out there who know that little tidbit of Fantastic Four alternative continuity and how it applies to Sue Richards. Can't verify it at all, but I'm mentioning it anyway, just because. Yeah, so, and then there's also Johnny. He, I think, even more so than Sue, more than anybody else, Morrison had a looser grasp of Johnny Storm than anybody else here. He plays Johnny as a kind of tragically disaffected, James Deanian, live fast, die young, suicidal thrill-seeker type. Rebel without a melting point, if you will. And that's certainly valid. I mean, and Johnny, when he first appeared, he was just a snot-nosed teenager. He was a hot-headed, self-centered, shallow little punk who was into fast cars and pretty girls. And in this miniseries, not much of that seems to have changed, at least on the exterior. I mean, but he just doesn't... Morrison... I'm not saying that what he does with Johnny is invalid, it's just that he doesn't seem to find much depth to him, and I think that's kind of a disservice to John. I mean, this thing was published in 2001, as the Fantastic Four were celebrating their 40th anniversary of existence. You'd think that somebody had done something with Johnny in those 40 years that would have resonated a little more strongly with Morrison, that he could have given Johnny a better shake. I mean, the third issue of the miniseries, which is supposed to be Johnny's issue, it's entitled Darkness and the Mole Man. And the story is really more about Namor and the Mole Man than it is about Johnny. The doom that Dr. Doom had in mind for him was basically to get him wet somehow and then throw him down a deep hole so that the Man-Thing can grab it. The Mole Man can grab him, blind him, and put him to work in his slave pits. That's it. It probably would have worked, too, if Namor had, it was in that issue where Sue began to unravel Doom's carefully laid strategies. She kind of got Namor out of the part that Doom had established for him to play, and the pieces, the dominoes, then began falling in the opposite direction of what Doom had in mind. But, yeah, they have to rescue Johnny, and, yeah, it's... So, yeah. There are some cool character moments and some little, facets that are teased out by Morrison. So as a character study, it does a good job, better than he does on plot. But let me come out and say now, what really, better than plot or character, what really does distinguish this miniseries and makes it worth your time is style, all right? Mood, atmosphere. This book is just suet thick with it, teeming with the stuff. Between Morrison's moody, evocative dialogue, that way he has of stringing words together to describe very familiar characters and concepts that makes you think, why has no other writer ever thought of doing that before? It seems like it's been an essential part of that thing all along. And between that and the unmistakable polish that brings to things, and giving credit to the artist, as I tend not to do as much as I should in these reviews, Jay Lee's grimy, visceral, darkly detailed artwork. He does pencils and inks, of course, just pent up and parceled out into little geometric panels, and at times, there are elements of his draftsmanship that make one think of J.H. Williams III, who was one of my favorite artists, only, darker and coarser and rougher, it's more metal, Yeah, so it's just these beautiful little drawings with snatches of heavy black ink crawling all over them like a thing alive, like a Lovecraftian horror crawling out of the pit. Yeah, which really helped to build that atmosphere I was talking about. And let's not forget the painted colors by Jose Villarrubia, which also imparts a powerful patina of paranoia to the proceedings. Yeah, it's pretty to look at, and it's kind of it's gritty and strange, and there's kind of a spattered effect to a lot of it. It heightens the sense of uncertainty and paranoia that's going on in here. So yeah, it's the mood that it evokes, and then the way it has of getting you to look at these 40-year-old characters in a different way. That's what really brings it in this series. it's not so much the story it's telling, which, as I've said, is not that exceptional plot-wise for a Fantastic Four story, and especially a Morrison-written one, but it's the way in which it's told. It's really almost tonally evocative of Shakespeare, in a way. In fact, Doom actually references The Tempest at one point in the story. Meanwhile, the family squabbles and the thickly ominous atmosphere starts... Well, also a little bit of The Tempest in there, but it also feels something like King Lear or Hamlet. There's one scene where Thing is holding the head of a Doombot, and he says something to the... I smell a rat going bad behind the radiator, to use my Ben Grimm voice, of which Chris Everly is so fond. That could almost be, how now, a rat? Like he's Hamlet seeking out Polonius behind the arras at that point. So yeah, it is a little bit, it's a little bit reminiscent of like some of the Shakespearean tragedies. I won't even say lesser tragedies. Distantly so, but still. On the whole, just the fact that it's this sort of drawing room drama, of like a family drama for the Fantastic Four, plus with superpowers and at least one giant robot who shows up in like the third and fourth issue. It's like the August Osage County of Fantastic Four stories. There, I said it. So yeah, it's good, interesting stuff. I mean, so yeah, Fantastic Four 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not a series that comes up very often in discussions of Morrison's best works or even his most underrated works. It really doesn't get mentioned very much at all. I think a lot of people tend to forget that this is something that Morrison even did, but he did it, and I read it, and I would say that you probably should too. Yeah, I'm not gonna give it the highest recommendation, but it's still a pretty darn high recommendation. Oh, and one last note for you Alicia Masters fans out there. Remember how I said that she seemed to be the only level head in the whole story, and she's got those models of her magic manipulating clay sitting around every place? At one point, Reed actually refers to her as a secret weapon of his. What if she's actually the one manipulating events? So, for her amusement. What if she's the stinker behind the scenes? It's just a thought. Just a fun little devilish thought. Okay, let's putter along to our next port of call, shall we? Now, the last time I recorded and released one of these episodes in October, I gave it kind of a loose Halloween theme. Tried to select and focus on comics that had to do with monsters or returning from the dead, things like that. But the content for this episode doesn't really have that going for it. But I do at least have, in my little bag of tricks, one comic that at least has a Halloween-worthy cover, even if the contents don't necessarily completely reflect that. It's Batman number 595, cover dated November 2001, written by Ed Brubaker, art by Scott McDaniel, and inks by Aaron Soud. And the front cover does indeed have a picture of little Bruce Wayne in a shot from his childhood, smiling and happy, dressed up in a little skeleton costume, flanked by jack-o'-lanterns with bat-shaped cutouts in the front of them, with a big Batman-shaped silhouette rising up behind him, foreshadowing his adult destiny. And the story inside isn't really a Halloween story per se, but it does at least involve a costume party, a fateful costume party for Bruce Wayne and his entire family. So yes, this, as I said, this was written by Ed Brubaker. Number 595 actually falls right in the middle of Ed Brubaker's 2-year run as a Batman writer, and it continues to play out a subplot that Brubaker began right out of the starting gate of his run on Batman, to wit, the return of a character called Lou Moxon. Now, longtime Bat fans will recognize that name right away, but he's a character that popped up, like so many Silver Age characters did, exactly once. In fact, it's really more than an Atomic Age story, really, because his one and only appearance in those days came in 1956 in Detective Comics number 235. A classic Bat story that's been reprinted a bunch of times and referenced a bunch of other times. It's called The First Batman. I'm sure you've at least heard of this. This is the story in which Bruce Wayne's father, Thomas Wayne, while Bruce was still a child, donned a bat-like costume at a costume party during Bruce's childhood, and that supposedly subconsciously influenced the adult Bruce to design his Batman costume for his war on crime. And Lou Moxon happened to be the generic gangster who showed up as a part of that story. And but more than just a throwaway story or a cute little attempt at bringing Bruce's father and making the Batman mantle seem more like a father and son legacy. Another contribution of that story that was fairly important to the Bat mythos as a whole was that Lou Moxon, after being foiled in his attempt to rob this costume charity gala by Thomas Wayne, then proceeded to take out a hit on Thomas and Martha Wayne, the seemingly random mugging perpetrated by criminal Joe Chill was actually a contract hit, taken out by vengeful gangster Lou Moxon. And so that story was mainly flashback, but then we return to the present when Batman, having dug up this piece of information somewhere, confronted Lou Moxon, and I think what happened was Moxon became so terrified at being confronted with his misdeeds by Batman that he ran out into traffic and was hit by a car or something. He died in some way that, tied off that loose end without Batman himself being responsible and getting blood on his hands, which in 1956 he certainly could not have done. So anyway, that's Lou Moxon. He didn't appear again in current monthly Batman comics. That story was reprinted several times, as I said, but he wasn't in an original story again until the Untold Legend of the Batman miniseries by Len Wein in 1980, I think. And even then, that wasn't even really a current continuity story. Lou Moxon remained dead. It was just an original retelling of that tale of how the Waynes came to shuffle off this mortal coil. So Ed Brubaker is the one who gets credit, though, for returning Lou Moxon to present-day Batman continuity in the post-crisis era, because Lou Moxon turns up and he's very much alive right at the beginning of Ed Brubaker's run. Not only that, but he brings with him a new character, a daughter, Mallory Moxon, whom we're told was a childhood playmate of Bruce's, and of course goes on to become a possible love interest for him in adulthood. Not the most original twist there, Ed Brubaker. Other people have tried that with Batman and other characters. Long-lost childhood friend turned love interest with a tragic connection to a member of the hero's rogues gallery. I'm pretty sure that happened to Spider-Man at least once. But anyway, Lou and Mallory Moxon turn up, and they help to characterize Brubaker's Batman run. Now, by issue number 595, as we join the action here, Batman, or Bruce, I should say, he's in mufti at this point, at one of his towers. He's hanging out with his bodyguard, Sacha Bordeaux. This is during that period in Batman history, when Sacha was hanging around. And he's looking through records and books of his, and he's trying to research the connection between Moxon and his parents. The story is entitled Out of the Past, appropriately, if not creatively enough, so the story is about him delving into this episode in his past, which was introduced again in that story, The First Batman, in Detective Comics number 235 back in the 50s. And he heads out, and he hits up one of Lou Moxon's former lieutenants, Consigliere, who knows a little more about the situation than Batman does, and or that Batman has been able to get out of Moxon himself. Apparently he's wary of approaching and interrogating Moxon personally, so he goes to somebody who's nearly as close to the issue as Moxon himself, but whose lips are a bit looser. And so it is from him, this mob lieutenant, that Batman learns the story of that fateful costume party and how his parents ended up on Lou Moxon's bad side. And it's narrated by the mob lieutenant. And the story is told visually in interestingly shaped panels. It sort of with rounded edges, sort of resemble the... I guess it's a fairly common convention for flashbacks to be told in panels with rounded corners. But the way McDaniel draws these, it almost... it kind of reminds me of cells of a film strip, like maybe a home movie. Anyway, this is how Batman and we the readers learn how this story, introduced in Detective number 235, fits into DC continuity post-crisis. And the interesting thing here, to me anyway, is that, as I said, this is an all-time classic Batman yarn. And it's been reprinted and also revisited and retold in other ways several times over the years. The untold legend of the Batman being one key example. But the last time before Batman number 595 that the first Batman chapter of Batman's life was touched upon was actually only 11 months earlier. This was cover dated November 2001, but just about a year before that, in Legends of the Dark Knight number 136, in the middle of a 5-part story written by James Robinson, we got a flashback to something similar. And in fact, I think I pointed this story up or spotlighted it in an earlier episode of the Time Bubble. If you care to go back to the archives and to poke around. And it's peculiar. These two stories are referencing the same, much earlier 1950s Batman story, but they approach it from such different angles. And perhaps out of respect for that James Robinson-written story, this one alters several aspects. It's almost as if some power that be, maybe the editor, or maybe some higher force of narrative homeostasis, is rationing out the details of that original story between these two latter accounts. Like, for example, that Legends of the Dark Knight story features Thomas Wayne in the proto-Batman suit, which doesn't happen in Batman number 595, but he does so to fight off a home invasion by somebody other than Lou Moxon, whereas this story gets Lou Moxon and the possibility of the hit taken out against Bruce's parents. So the implication, intentional or not, is that the original story has been retconned as a conflation of two separate episodes from young Bruce Wayne's childhood, as if, the conflation took place within Bruce's own troubled, possibly demented psyche. Like he somehow remembered these two. He conflated the two together into one odd, crude, childishly recounted, i.e. Silver Age style story, which plays right into the hands of Grant Morrison when he came along a couple of years later for his own Batman run, into his own ideas that, for example, a lot of the Silver Age Batman stories from the 50s and 60s are actually warped memories or hallucinations of Batman generated by his own mind. They're either distortions of things that happened to him or complete fabrications of his fevered little bat brain. Because Morrison is more than flirting, dancing, the hot lambada with the idea that Batman / Bruce Wayne is actually cuckoo. Zurinar, baby! And so here's a good classic example of something that that Morrison could tap into to support his position. By the end of this story, Batman is it's triggered flashbacks of his own as he remembers his own side of the events of that night. His father dressed in his Zorro costume, not the proto-bat suit, as I said, that was in James Robinson's story from Legends of the Dark Knight, but Thomas Wayne is dressed as Zorro in this story. Martha Wayne is dressed as Cleopatra. She was dressed as a butterfly in the 1956 original, sort of a diurnal equivalent to this scary nocturnal bat. And Bruce himself is dressed in the cute little skeleton outfit seen on the front cover of Batman number 595, as if an acknowledgement of his latter fate, i.e. that young Bruce Wayne, quote-unquote, heavy irony here on my part, died on the night he witnessed his parents gunned down in Crime Alley. I've never accepted that notion, and Matt and I have had multiple arguments over it. But anyway, so he had dead boy walking. There's a significance there. But Batman sits and broods, as he's wont to do, about events later that night, about how he was fascinated with his father's Zorro costume, and his father mentioned to him that there was a cool movie that Thomas had seen when he was a little boy about Zorro, and Bruce immediately expressed an interest in going to see it, and Thomas just chuckles and says, well, we'll have to go take you to see it next time it plays at the Repertory Theater, won't we? So, another reason for Batman to feel guilty. Another 6-ton weight to add to his already heavy burden for the deaths of his parents. Now he feels like it's his responsibility because he wanted to see this Zorro movie that he and his parents had been in harm's way in the first place. So another fun little wrinkle to the tortured mythology of Batman, added by the story and the way it's told. And as to the ballad of Thomas Wayne and Lou Moxon itself, another thing that this version of the story changes is it's not a Halloween party at Wayne Manor or anything. It's a charity fundraiser in a neutral spot, City Hall perhaps. And Lou Moxon doesn't show up with his boys to rob the place, as he did in the original Detective number 235 story. Instead, he's just attending as a guest with a couple of his boys, and somebody comes in to tell him that his nephew has been mortally wounded while during a failed bank heist. The nephew is something of a loose cannon. And so Lou Moxon, cursing under his breath, he sends that same consigliere that Batman is grilling to learn this story in the present day to go over and talk to Thomas Wayne, giving him his assurances that he will come to no harm, nor will his family, and brings him out of the masquerade party, still dressed as Zorro, to come across town to where Moxon's nephew is being held. And thanks to his Hippocratic oath, Dr. Wayne feels compelled to operate on the kid. But when Moxon attempts to pay him off, Wayne wheels on him and punches him in the mouth, and leaving him with a further warning: if you dare go after my family as a result of any of this, you will be sorry. So we still get Thomas Wayne punching a gangster in the face, which did happen in the original story, but it's just done for a much more respectable, Hippocratic, and also realistic reason. Instead of him going after bad robber men, he's caught up in this much more morally complex situation. And it's only thanks to the intervention of the consigliere, who's telling Batman his story years later, that Thomas Wayne is not gunned down right then and there. So, again, interesting angles that Brubaker is introducing to this classic, or to at least to half of that classic 1950s Bat story that writers just love to revisit. Of course, the only part of this story that really interests Batman is whether or not he can use it as evidence against the case he's building in his mind against Lou Moxon for his responsibility for his parents' deaths. So, of course, he puts that question directly to the mob lieutenant he's been grilling once the story is finished. He says, a few months later, Thomas and Martha Wayne were murdered. Was that Moxon's doing? And without making eye contact with the Batman as he says this, the man says, no, Lou was in the midst of his campaign by then, and I clearly recall how angry he was that someone had taken his revenge from him. So according to this guy, Moxon is not the one who dispatched Joe Chill to kill the Waynes. Funny that this should be unfolding here now, because just a couple of years later in Superman Batman, the title co-starring both Superman and Batman, written by Jeff Loeb, art by Ed McGuinness, the nature of the Wayne's murder and the person responsible is again called into question. Yeah, so fun. There's kind of a connection here between the stuff I'm rereading for the time bubble and the stuff that I'm just getting around to reading now from 2003. Yes. Time is a peculiar thing. Anyway, at the end of this little interview, Batman disappears, and the lieutenant is left to bury his face in his hands and say, oh, thank God. Could just be that he's happy that the Batman is out of his bathroom. Because, as he says just one panel earlier, honestly, you scare the hell out of me, Batman. Always have. But it could be that he's sighing in relief because he's been able to fool the Batman into believing that Lou Moxon wasn't really responsible for the Wayne's murder. So it's left a little bit up in the air there, but the Batman is satisfied, at least for the moment. The detective in him is willing to accept this man's testimony, given under the conditions that it is and in the emotional state that he's in. So the Batman's line of inquiry is temporarily cut off at that point, and he goes off to his parents' grave yet again to sit and brood and remember how keen he was on Zorro thanks to his dad's costume that night, and to blame himself because of that for his parents getting murdered. And so it goes. Fun take on the first Batman story. I wouldn't exactly say fun. I take that back. It's an interesting take on the subject matter of the first Batman story from 1956. But also, of note in this issue, as I said earlier, this is part of the Sacha Bordeaux years, when we had this extra supporting character temporarily in the Bat family, just this plainclothes bodyguard who was responsible for Bruce Wayne's safety, who then stumbles upon the secret that he's also Batman and finds herself having to incorporate that whole extra planet's worth of difficulties and complications into her doing her basic daily job of keeping Bruce Wayne safe. In order to protect Bruce Wayne, she also has to aid the Batman. It's a combination package deal, and she against both parties' protests, she continues to honor it. So she's kind of dragged kicking and screaming into Batman's world and told, look, if you're going to be here, if you're going to protect me in either of my guises, you're going to have to accept all of this as well. And she does so, but not entirely willingly. She's not one to suffer bats gladly, I guess you might say. And she was really an interesting addition to the Bat cast for that reason. I mean, in this issue, she's not even... At that time, she did adopt a costume and go out on patrol with Batman. You know, she did that once or twice. But in this issue, she wasn't a costume sidekick. She was just a foil for Bruce/Batman. Now, it was her trenchant exchanges with Bruce bookend the action in this story. It's her. It begins with Bruce Wayne's deep in his research, and Sasha's there with him, and Bruce starts to read her the riot act about carrying a firearm while she's in his service. Telling her in no uncertain terms, "We do not use guns around here," and she rather sensibly replies, "Not to sound like the NRA here, but." Guns didn't kill your parents, a person killed your parents, and guns are a necessity for the kind of work I need to do to protect you. She builds a fairly solid case, so naturally, Bruce Wayne clams up and pulls a Commissioner Gordon on her, disappears before she even finishes talking. And she just kind of mutters to herself, yeah, real mature. So, and she's got him dead to rights, too. He swings away, his control freak tendencies having been pretty well punctured by Sasha, and he's just thinking to himself, damn it, other people can't just do as you say, they always need to ask why. He's almost pouting. So she's kind of the one that precipitates his retreatist plunge into his Batman identity and into Bruce Wayne's past, but she's also there at the other end of the story to welcome him back. To the present. It's good narrative symmetry there. But beyond that, now Sasha was a worthy and interesting, if temporary, addition to the cast, precisely because, more than any of Bruce's other allies, even Alfred, I would say, she cuts right through his Bat BS. She is not drawn in nor impressed by his mystique at all. The Byronic posturing and brooding, the fear-mongering, the weirdly specific vigilante code, the funny little crime-fighting toys. She just... It is one of her chief delights in her work to just stand around and poke holes in Batman's, quote, adolescent fixations, as she calls them, and perfectly justifiably so. She comes right through and says it in this issue when she's talking about his problem with guns. And he's constantly challenging him, and therefore the reader and the writer, to justify them. And really, that's the key to the whole thing, I think. I think more than anything else, she was probably necessary for Brubaker as a part of his creative process. She provides the deuteragonist here. She allows him to work quasi-Socratically, via the Socratic method, around Brubaker's own reservations about the entire Bat mythos. She voices his own inner concerns about these long-held conventions of Batman, and challenges him as writer to get inside Bruce's head still deeper and work around them without undermining Batman's appeal too much. So she was a valuable and an interesting character to have around, and she was in rare form in this issue. So that's another reason why Batman number 595 is fun to read. It's not a perfect Halloween treat, but still a pretty good one. And word about the art. It's Scott McDaniel, and I still don't like him. His drawings of people are just so weird and angular and pointy. Everybody he draws looks squinty-eyed. He's not a favorite artist of mine. But, you know what? I am willing to give him extra bonus points for one of the scenes from the flashback to the masquerade party on page 12. I see what I'm almost positive are little cameo appearances by the versions of Dracula, the Mummy, and I think the Wolfman too, as seen in one of my all-time favorite movies, Mad Monster Party. Stop-motion animation feature film by Rankin Bass Studio, who also gave the world Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I'm sure you know Rankin Bass. So those versions of those classic monsters seem to make it into the background of one of these scenes here. And if that's what Mr. McDaniel has in mind, I salute him. Love that movie. Watch it every Halloween if I can, and I certainly will this year, because here in 2017, it'll be celebrating its 50th anniversary. So there you go. Batman number 595, and also Mad Monster Party. You haven't seen it? Do it. All right, staying on the DC side of the aisle for a little longer here, let's help ourselves to let's take a double lap with the Flash. Yeah, I've got 2 issues of the Jeff Johns Flash run, which you may remember I talked about in the very first time here on the Time Bubble. The Flash Volume 2, of course, this is still the Wally West version of the Flash, number 178, and also from that same month, there's a cover date. November of 2001, Flash Secret Files and Origins, number 3. Now, it's probably wiser of me to start with the Secret Files and Origins issue, since I think it actually does take place before number 178, but I'm going to start with 178 anyway, just because I've got a certain bias towards the monthly issues of a series versus specials. Just your mileage may vary, but I'm going to go ahead and do that anyway. So, yeah, number 178. Starts with a terrific Brian Boland cover. Since just about every cover he draws is terrific, but it's the blurb promises Grodd ... like you've never seen him before. And it's sure enough, it's a gorilla cover, and you can't go wrong with gorillas because they sell comics. Yes, sir. Gotta say though, much as I like Brian Boland's work, this is not the best. It's not the best gorilla he's ever drawn, and it's certainly not the best image of Gorilla Grodd anybody's drawn. If you call up the image at some point here in Flash number 178, it's a little cheesy looking. It doesn't really look like the Grodd we've come to know. It just kind of looks like a generic ape, only meaner. And really what it reminds me of, there is a really cheesy horror movie, if you can even call it that, called, it was marketed under a couple of different names, but the one I know is Ape. That's A*P*E. It's a South Korean co-production. It was made in the 70s, around the time as that crappy Dino De Laurentiis remake of King Kong, and not by accident at all. That movie ripped off that movie and Jaws and a couple of other things, including MASH, because the way they styled the Ape title with the A, the letters and the asterisks between them, is pretty clearly a swipe of the MASH logo. Really cheaps out special effects. It's just a guy in a gorilla costume. But this Brian Boland image of Grodd on this cover reminds me more of Ape than it does of Grodd. Sorry to say, but I just got to call him like I see him. I'm pretty sure I saw that Ape thing, and for at least a few minutes of it, as much as I could stand, on TNT's 100% Weird block back in the 90s. And it stuck with me for sheer awfulness. But anyway, let's move on from the cover to the gorilla thriller that awaits us inside. Hey. Number 178, it's a fun issue of the Flash, of Jeff Johns' run. The interior art is, of course, pencils by Scott Collins and inks by Doug Hazelwood, and letters, very distinctive letters at that, by Gaspar Saladino. And it's even more so than some of the issues that surround it. This issue, and I mean this in kind of a good way, reads like one of the old, early 80s daring new Flash issues as produced by Cary Bates and Carmine Infantino. It smacks of the kind of innovation that they were trying to do in those days. Just in the general tone and the throwing of lots of cool and different things at the reader, some of which work better than others, but still you appreciate that they're in there trying. And the issue begins with the introduction of a new character to the DC Universe that I'm sorry didn't get a little more use than he did. That would be Mr. Cage and his Cage Factory, this company, this sort of security firm that he started. The aim of which is to custom build and implement incarceration solutions for superhuman criminals. So he's there with this big truck with the Cage Factory logo plastered all over, which is a really cool, well-designed logo. And the vehicle that it's on is well-designed, too. Kudos to Scott Collins for both those things, because it looks like the kind of thing that I could picture on highways, in the real world, let alone in the DC Universe. It's a believable design. And it's a concept that I think the DC Universe really could. It was a neat, practicable idea for the DC Universe. It's something that they needed. But unfortunately, a couple of different factors combined to spoil the Cage Factory's IPO, as it were, one of which is union protesters from local labor union 242 in Keystone City, led by Union Commissioner Keith Kenyon. I'm not sure this is the first time he appeared in this capacity, but it's at least one of the first times we get to see Keith Kenyon, formerly a costumed supervillain called Goldface, in the role of Union Commissioner in Keystone City. It's a really cool idea of Geoff Johns, again, to use this character this way. He's like a super Jimmy Hoffa. Plus, throwing him in, he's originally a Green Lantern villain. He's not a member of a major or minor of the Flash's rogues gallery, although the Flash, I think Barry rather than Wally, had certainly encountered Goldface before. He was never really one of the Flash's rogues. He was a Green Lantern villain. So bringing him into the Flash fold would have been the perfect premise or excuse for a Flash Green Lantern linkage and crossover that I think never quite materialized. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think the Goldface connection between Flash and Green Lantern was ever really exploited. But still, his presence here and just using a labor union like Local 242 was again a good move on Johns' part. And just to build the blue collar character of Keystone, it's a touch of local color, and it is collar blue. Yeah. So, yeah, one sort of wonders why Johns did seize upon Goldface, if not to build connections between Flash and Green Lantern. He could have just used a minor Flash villain, too, but Goldface works just fine. So anyway, he and his union underlings are there to protest the Cage Factory, who are non-union, who are breaking into their closed shop there in Keystone City and offering to incarcerate as a demonstration of their abilities at the Cage Factory. They're going to transport Gorilla Grodd. And Grodd is the other factor that ruins the initial public offering of the Cage Factory, because with a little help from a couple of Flash rogues that put in a quickie cameo to bust him out, just to generate some chaos and put Wally West through his paces, so Grodd gets loose, and he causes all kinds of havoc throughout Keystone City until Wally shows up and takes him down. And Wally is called away from wishing his wife Linda luck on her first day of medical school. So there's another interesting new turn in this issue that Johns is introducing, because Linda is in the middle of a career change. She had been a television reporter. It was in that capacity that Wally West first met her, before Geoff Johns, or even Mark Waid for that matter, got their hands on the character. And she's remained in that role, that career, for all this time. But recent events, I think involving the Weather Wizard threatening the safety of a baby that Wally and Linda briefly believed to be theirs, but was actually the Weather Wizard's own son. I think the helplessness that Linda experienced during that or a similar catastrophe led her to feel kind of helpless and useless, and it had reawakened in her what we're told is an old urge or desire for her. Apparently we're told that, quote, "I always struggled between journalism and medicine," end quote. That's a quote from Linda there. As apparently she always thought about being a doctor or a nurse or something. I think she's aiming to be a pediatrician, ultimately. But she's starting slow and maybe getting something close to a more general medicine degree first before, moving on to the more specialized instruction she'll need. So she's just beginning, the base level of pre-med, I guess, in this issue. And Wally was wishing her luck when he had to go off and deal with Grodd. There maybe have been some hints scattered around in the Wade run, but I kind of don't buy that this is something that Linda has always wanted for herself. I've seen no indication that she's had any inclination towards a career in medicine in any way, or shape, or form. But what the hey, it's happening here. She's leaving behind the ultimate stereotypical superhero girlfriend career, i.e. crusading reporter, to go to number 2, medical profession. There have been plenty of superhero girlfriends who have been nurses or doctors. Jane Foster immediately comes to mind, so Linda's joining those ranks, starting in this issue. And at the end of this issue, once the threat of Grodd has been safely sorted away, we do get a little epilogue in which officers of the Keystone City PD break into the apartment of Hartley Rathaway, the Pied Piper, and accuse him will place him under arrest for the murder of his parents, wealthy socialites Osgood and Rachel Rathaway. And instead of fighting back or trying to escape, the shamed Hartley simply sits there and says, "I confess." It's a full-page splash on the last page of the issue. The Pied Piper, a perpetrator of parricide? Perish the thought. But it's another one of these neat little subplots that Johns is juggling here. This issue just slings you from one interesting thing to another. It's well-paced. It's got that sort of crowded and utterly compressed fun of the early 80s run when Cary Bates was maintaining all kinds of subplots and telling those puzzle-style single-issue stories for which he was so famous in those days. So yeah, all we need is just a one-shot villain in an ugly costume, and the feeling would be complete. Yeah. So, for example, since this is a Grodd story, why not Psychon? And if you don't know who Psychon is, that just demonstrates to you how forgettable that character was. Suffice to say, he was a one-off character who had a vendetta against Gorilla Grodd specifically. And he was in that Bates and Infantino run on The Flash, back in the late Bronze Age. Ah, yes, and Grodd. Then there's Grodd. And then there's Grodd. You may have noticed I was kind of pussyfooting around the subject of Grodd himself and dealt with everything else I had to say about this issue before I got to Grodd. Because he is the kind of the 10-ton gorilla in the room, isn't he? I mean, he's the main villain of the issue. It's the first time Grodd has appeared in Johns' run on The Flash. And he's meant to be another beneficiary of John's Rogues Reclamation program. But I have to say, for my money, he's not its greatest success story. Okay, so Johns is reimagining Grodd. He's trying to reintroduce us to the animal side of Grodd. He's trying to bring across savagery, ferocity, ferality. Just to remind everyone that Grodd, in addition to being a dangerous villain, he's a mad animal. And to remind us of how scary that ought to be. With the wrong approach, an intelligent, telepathic, Machiavellian gorilla can scan as fairly silly, and it often has in some of Grodd's appearances in the past. Johns wants to balance that out with Grodd in this issue and remind us about how terrifying a telepathic, rampaging ape can be, but the problem here is that Johns takes things a little too far the other way with Grodd, and he overemphasizes Grodd's animal nature. I mean, most of Grodd's dialogue, he's speaking English, of course, but most of his dialogue is urs, rars, and roars, and he's constantly being shown with glowing red eyes, and his jaws are constantly in every panel dripping blood. Where the blood is coming from? Did he just bite his own lip? Did he actually bite somebody's arm off at some point, or it just happened off panel? You'd think the blood would dry at some point, but it's just constantly spewing all over the place out of his jaws, and it's too much. It's over the top. This version of Grodd just comes off as more lurid and cheesy than truly scary. It's like a product of 1950s schlock horror, whether we're talking about films or comics, whether we're talking about like a Hammer Films horror movie or like a 1950s EC comic, or better yet, one of the EC's third-rate imitators that just went in for all the blood and gore with none of the craftsmanship. What would have been a little more effective would be like a skillful juxtaposition, there's a word I can pronounce, of intellect and savage bloodlust. It would have been more effective, chilling even. But instead of, like Hannibal Lecter or Alfred Hitchcock, or something, instead of something more along those lines, Johns gives us a William Castle or Roger Corman, or even like a Toho flick, something like the Ape movie I mentioned earlier, just a guy in a gorilla costume wrecking model buildings. It's really not that much scarier than that. I mean, savage does not always equal scary, all right? It would be scary if you were actually in the comic with the people as this ape drags his knuckles around, roaring and breaking buildings and throwing cars with his mind. But his force of mind abilities are really scarier when applied with more devious intent. Here the difference in his behavior from other appearances of Grodd is somewhat explained when Wally mentioned offhand that he's, quote, drugged up on page 14. So you can use that to explain this abrupt deviation from Grodd's past behavioral idiom. But, yeah, like I said, it just really doesn't work to evoke the potential terror that a mad animal who also has the cunning and of a professional psychopath like a Hannibal Lecter, and also the intellect and the telepathic abilities, which he could be wielding like a mad doctor's surgical forceps, but instead he's wielding it like a jackhammer to just rip Keystone City apart as he goes on an undirected rampage. As it happens, this take on Grodd didn't really take elsewhere in the DC line. Just a couple of years later, again, to turn to things that I'm reading right now from 2003, a couple of years down the line, Grodd shows up as a minor antagonist in the first couple of issues of The Outsiders, and he's totally in command of his faculties. He's leading an army of guerrillas in a rampage throughout New York City, a sort of a guerrilla invasion. They hijack a ship and land in New York, and apparently we learn eventually that he's doing this at the behest of a mysterious third party. But he doesn't seem at all like the Grodd that Johns is giving us here. So, yeah, we learn in this story that he is the only villain that's ever given Wally West nightmares. Wally himself admits to that. That much I believe. It's just even when written like this, a rampaging telepathic gorilla could be pretty scary, but not as scary as he ought to be, and not as scary as I think Johns wanted us to find him. Yeah, and the story just ends with Wally, outlasting him and giving him a double shot of high voltage electricity and elephant tranquilizers. That finally brings him down, and he's brought to Iron Heights. Another Jeff Johns innovation for the Flash line, although it certainly appeared before this issue. So he's Grodd is imprisoned there for the first time, and it's. And that's kind of a setup for the Run Riot story that will run in the Flash title several months thence. And there is mention along the line, too, of Grodd's home, Gorilla City, and how the government is, quote, in anarchy, which is a reference to the 1999's infamous J.L. Ape annuals crossover, in which Sullivar finally, the king of Gorilla City, finally bites the big one after so many decades as a part of the DC universe. And it's his nephew, I think, Nnamdi, who takes over as both monarch of Gorilla City and also its heroic protector, because he wears this giant, like, kaiju-like mechanical suit. Kaiju, not really. Mecha. I think that's the otaku term. Is a giant mechanical gorilla suit called Grogamesh, named after a legendary hero of Gorilla City mythology. Apparently his Nnamdi's rule isn't completely accepted by the citizenry, and Grodd is able to take advantage in a couple of different stories of that chaos. And so this is our first glimpse at Johns' take on Grodd, and I do find it wanting. Though I'm kind of curious. I'm going to place a call out to, loyal Bubble listener and longtime fan of The Flash, Chris Beckett, to find out what, if he happens to have read this issue, as I'm sure he has, and if he remembers what Johns did with Grodd in this story and others that followed, what his takeaway of this new take on Grodd is, because I personally didn't much like it. Yeah, I'm going to, as a counteroffer, you might call it, to recommend a story in which we get a little bit closer to Grodd's potential as a horrifying force. The Peter David run on Supergirl, which I've mentioned a few times here on this podcast, from the mid-90s. Issues 3 and 4 of that. This is when the artist was still Gary Frank. So Peter David and Gary Frank. It's set in the middle of the Final Night crossover, so there's that to get through. Plus, there's the whole fact that this is the post-crisis shape-changing protoplasmic blob from another dimension who merges with suicidal, demon-worshipping young artist and eventually sprouts flaming wings and becomes an earthbound angel version of Supergirl. So a lot to unpack there. But if you can fight your way through that, issues 3 and 4 of that series are a Grodd story, and it's about Grodd using his telepathic powers to regress the entire population of Supergirl's hometown of Leesburg, Virginia, to an animal-like state. It goes from just the simple, stark panic and terror of a rampaging gorilla to the deep-seated, blood-churning horror of a telepathic gorilla. Yeah, it's a much more psychological approach for Grodd, and it's... If you could find a balance between that and what Jeff Johns is doing here, it's somewhere, I forget if it was in this story or one in The Secret Files and Origins, some writer mentions that you were never, Wally is quoted as saying, in one of these two stories, you were never sure whether he was going to, he's talking to you, he's gloating over your inability to stop him, and he'd just like to just come and rip your throat out with his teeth. So, a Grodd who can, again, I'm going to reference Hannibal Lecter here, as dangerously unpredictable as that, who's just all the intelligence and cunning of a human super genius criminal mastermind, but also just bubbling just beneath the surface, but usually held in check, the ferocity of a mad animal. If you can somehow combine those two, do a story where Grodd is standing there, perhaps quoting Kierkegaard or something, and then he tears your ribcage open in mid-sentence, I think then we will achieve what Johns was really hoping for. Yeah. So anyway, there's your Grodd for you. And ably illustrated throughout by the team of Scott Collins and Doug Hazelwood, by the way. Collins, the style that he pretty much just developed expressly for this run of The Flash with Jeff Johns, he continues to impress with that style on both the micro and macro visual levels. He gives us plenty of big wide shots, big sweeping wide lens panoramic cityscapes. There are a couple here where there's like a double page spread of the devastation that Grodd causes, and it's big and it's epic, but it's also as wide open as these depictions are. These images are, they're just packed to the hilt with Jeff Darrow-like fine detail, which is not easy to insert into a scene. He worked at putting these panels together, and so kudos and excellent work, and this run of Johns's would not have been what it was without Scott Collins' contributions, I freely admit. And I gotta say, I do like Doug Hazelwood's inks on his pencils a little better in this issue than I do on Jose Marzan Jr.'s in Secret Files and Origins number 3. Speaking of which, by means of segue, let's turn our attention now to that issue, which, as I said, came out the same month, maybe a week or two before Flash number 178, and it's kind of a lead-in for it. The focus here is the all-new, all-different, and all-deadly Rogues Gallery. In fact, the title of the lead story in this issue is Rogues. It was... So the new officially organized, we're not just talking about random confederation of Flash villains that occasionally get together. We're talking about the Rogues coming together as a tight-knit team of specific group of Flash Rogues organized by the mysterious new underworld figure Blacksmith. So that was sort of teased on the last page of the Flash Iron Heights special, which introduced the eponymous prison to DC Universe lore. So this new Rogues Gallery also factors into Flash number 178 in that they free Grodd in that story. But they were only briefly in that issue. They're much more front and center in Secret Files and Origins number 3. Also of importance here, and kind of acting as the POV character for the reader and tying the whole thing together, this exploration of the various changes Johns has been making to Keystone City and to Flash's Rogues Gallery, is a new character you may remember called Hunter Zolomon. That's right, Hunter Zolomon makes his first appearance in this issue, a disgraced CIA villain profiler who is looking to make a new start after a serious injury that it was a sting that went wrong, in which he not only suffered a career-ending injury, damaged his leg, made it difficult for him to walk. He has to walk with a crutch or a cane now, but it also resulted in the death of his father-in-law and his estrangement from his wife, who was a fellow CIA agent. So he's kind of on the downswing here, and he ends up in Keystone City looking to make a new life for himself as a KCPD rogues profiler. And so as he takes the train into Keystone City and witnesses the cityscape coming into view around him, he, again drawn by Scott Collins, and the story is of course written by Jeff Johns, he's reviewing dossiers of the various Flash rogues, old and new, and he's kind of getting for himself a sense of this blue-collar metropolis that is Keystone City. It's trying to, and this is also part of another ongoing project of Geoff Johns to insert some local color, which again is collar blue for Keystone City. He's trying to establish Wally West as, quote, the people's hero protecting the people's city. So this sort of proletarian mystique is continuing to be developed here, and Hunter Zolomon, as a newcomer to the city, helps Johns to inject this impression that he wants his readers to have of this reimagined Keystone City. Hunter Zolomon is he allows him to piggyback a few of his ideas, introduce or reintroduce or further develop them in the minds of new and regular readers. And sure enough, Hunter Zolomon shows up, and right off the bat, he's able to assist in the apprehension of one of the rogues, and that is Murmur. Actually, he doesn't quite pull off the apprehension because Murmur's fellow rogues show up and rescue him from the scene of his crime, but he does at least prove his worth, Hunter Zolomon does, in assisting the KCPD and the Flash, with whom he develops kind of an instant rapport, in tracking down the rogues as they go about their devilry in Keystone City. And in the course of which, Wally does something pretty cool with his costume, which is made of pure solidified Speed Force energy. He's able to use it to encapsulate this little anthrax vial that Murmur was about to use to release into Keystone City and cause chaos to cover his escape. Wally is able to actually seal it off within a little pocket of Speed Force energy, and it leads me to think, what other possible applications could there be for Wally's suit? I mean, could he eventually become as adept with forming little pseudopods of it that he could use it kind of like the Venom's symbiotic costume, for example? Would it be that versatile? It sort of makes you think. It's a neat trick. It's one of the little twists and variations on established concepts that really skilled comics writers are able to concoct, and Geoff Johns is certainly a part of that class of creator. So this story introduces Hunter Zolomon. It gives you a new look at the Rogues Gallery, fleshing them out a little more from the little teaser we got at the end of Iron Heights. Further develops Keystone City as a workers' paradise. We do get an appearance by Union Commissioner Keith Kenyon, Goldface, in here, and even an intro on the very last page of this lead story to the new Thinker, who is an important figure in for you TV viewers, because he's going to be the big bad in season number, I guess we're up to 4 now? That's right? Yeah, I think so. 4 of The Flash. Yep, they just call him DeVoe there, but he is indeed the Thinker, who is a Flash villain who goes all the way back to the Jay Garrick days. Here, reintroduced in a purely cybernetic guise. And in addition to the lead story, Rogues, featuring all that good stuff I just mentioned, this Secret Files and Origins issue also contains several profile pages, which is an expected feature of these SFO specials that DC was putting out in quantity during the late 90s and early 2000s. And they're mostly profiles of the friends and foes of the Flash, all text written by Geoff Johns himself, art by Various, sort of a quasi-who's who styled little factual profiles. There's also a quickie Impulse and Max Mercury gag page with art by Jason Johnson. And here's where Chase fans need to sit up and take note. Those of you who, I know you're out there, who enjoyed the Chase series of the late 90s. Featuring Agent Cameron Chase of the DEO, and yes, that is where the Department of Extra-Normal Operations, that's been such a central part of the Supergirl TV series, originated. It came from the Chase series, and she was kind of like the Agent Scully of the DC universe. This was the late 90s. It was definitely X-Files influenced, but Chase went out. She was kind of like, for you older fans, she was almost like Kolchak the Night Stalker, too, except the threats she faced were generally real. She went out and faced the creepy, weird underbelly of the DC universe, went into the dark, dusty corners of the DCU, and handled the dirtier cases that superheroes overlooked or that slipped through the cracks on them. That was the basic precept. Her father had been kind of a low-level, thrill-seeking, you can't even really call them crime. He was part of a 70s movement of people, of like hobbyist superheroes and supervillains. It was all kind of a game to them, who just put on costumes and fight each other for kicks, kind of the silly fads that the 70s produced. The problem was one of the villains ended up taking the game a little too seriously and killed a bunch of people, including Chase's father, and she never quite forgave the long underwear set for that, and so she's always had kind of a mad-on against the long underwear crowd for that reason, doesn't really trust them, doesn't like interacting with them. But we learn in this story, in the back of Secret Files and Origins number 3, that Wally West is one of those heroes that she's willing to make exception for. He's a good egg. He doesn't hide behind a secret identity. The people know who he is. He's the people's hero for the people's city. And Chase apparently can respect that. So we have this story here. It's written, actually, by co-creators of the Cameron Chase character, D. Curtis Johnson and J.H. Williams III, with inks by another original creative team member, Mick Gray. The pencils, though, are not done by J.H. Williams III, which is kind of too bad. As I've already said in this episode, I'm a fan of his pencils. The pencils instead are by one Diego Barreto. And I don't know, maybe Eric Nolan Wethington can fill us in on this. I don't know if he's any relation to another one of my favorite artists, Eduardo Barreto. But I do like his stuff as we see it here. It's definitely more reminiscent of the nice, clean style of a Tom Grummett or a Paul Pelletier than it is of J.H. Williams III. I like it. Wouldn't be not as good as seeing Williams himself drawing it, of course, but at least Williams is involved in some way. So it's just a quickie little 6-page story. Out of this, I think it's a 48-page one-shot. Yep, 48 pages. So 6 of it is given over to this little story, which it's kind of a prequel, if you will, to the story in Flash number 178 with Grodd. It tells the story of how Grodd was tracked down and captured prior to his appearance as the package, let's say the trial passenger for the dry run of Mr. Cage's Cage Factory. Prior to that, we were told that over 20 DEO agents were mowed down in the attempt to overpower him at whatever he was using as a base. So we have here in this story Cameron Chase just meeting up for hot dogs with Wally West in a public park and just picking his brain a little bit about Grodd, and Wally letting her know just exactly how scary, dangerous Grodd is, just setting us up for John's attempt at driving home, showing, not telling, how scary Grodd is, and for my money, not entirely succeeding, but there you are. So, this is one of a few random little appearances that Cameron Chase made around the DC Universe after her own series was canceled after entirely too brief a run. Many people identify that as one of the more underrated series of the past 30 years. I know my friend Ian Levinstein, if he's listening, and I'll bet he is, would agree with me when I say that. So yeah, if you're a Chase completist, don't miss Secret Files and Origins number 3. It's also just kind of a neat, scary little story because, there's kind of a gruesome cliffhanger to this story. I won't spoil it for you. When Chase finds out the hard way exactly how dangerous Grodd is and what kind of a horrific death trap those 20-plus DEO agents are walking into. And Chase is just a little bit too late in warning them against that. So, anyway, it's kind of a Grodd-heavy month here, November of 2001, in the Flash's world, but an enjoyable one for all that. And now, let's go from Grodds to gods. Let us venture forth back across to the Marvel side of the multiverse and take a look at an interesting little Thor comic that Marvel put out in late 2001. It's a 2-issue miniseries. It's entitled Thor Godstorm. And I happen to have only the first of the 2 issues with me here, but it's a great creative team behind this 2-issue story. It's written by Kurt Busiek, who at that time was still riding the tide of celebrity in the comics world, with art by Steve the Dude Rude, and colors by Greg Wright. And it's a really sweet-looking little comic. It's got a painted cover by the dude himself, of course. Interior art is more penciled. But it's a neat little it's a story told on a couple of different levels. It's an unmistakable Lee and Kirby encomium. All right, it harkens back to the Silver Age of Thor without question. it takes place in a couple different time eras. There's a framing device that's set in Scandinavia in 912 AD on the coast of the North Sea, and also set in in or about 1963 AD, or whatever near contemporary years the real-world equivalent of 1963 in Marvel time. You know, it's set back in Thor's early days in his mortal guise of Don Blake in early Marvel history. Okay, just like a classic old Silver Age issue of Journey into Mystery, it's separated between Thor adventures in these two eras. It's like 25% Tales of Asgard and 75% contemporary, i.e. Silver Age Thor. And then there's that framing device I mentioned, which is about a pair of youths. There's a studious, credulous, not especially sharp-witted young blonde fellow whose heart is in the right place. And then there's his dark-haired little playmate who's attempting to corrupt him and coax him away from his chores to come play war games with the other boys. And they're set upon by a white-beard old storyteller who criticizes them for their lack of work ethic and determination and dedication. And so he manages to lead them away from their other pursuits and to sit them down. He tries to talk some sense into them by telling them a tale of heroic perseverance starring none other than Thor himself. And it's fairly obvious as this framing sequence continues on through the issue that the yellow-haired and black-haired youths are supposed to be equivalents of Thor and Loki. And the storyteller, clearly and unsurprisingly Odin, which is not to say that these characters are these other characters, that it's not actually Thor, Loki, and Odin in disguise or as youths or whatever, but no, it's their roles in the story and their relations to one another are kind of similar to what one would find in the new Thor myths unfolding in comics. And Odin has been traditionally associated as a kind of a patron of storytellers and bards. In fact, he was shown in some of the older Eddas to assume mortal guise and actually travel around in the guise of a storyteller. And to take this another step further, if you ever feel like dipping your toes into Alex Ross and Jim Krueger's little divine comedy of the Marvel Universe, Earth X, Universe X, and Paradise X, it's supposed to be sort of the equivalent of Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso in Dante's The Divine Comedy. It's awfully overwrought and bulky. There's a lot of stuff to read in there, but there are some really cool twists on classic Marvel ideas and connecting them together in some peculiar ways. Some working better than others, as always. But there was a Paradise X miniseries in which it's posited that Odin himself, the Marvel Universe Odin, and the Asgardians have never been what they appeared to be, and that Odin was originally literally a human storyteller who basically dreamed the entire Asgardian race into being. He encountered a race of shape-shifting alien beings from another world who were desperate for an identity, and he was able to project all of these Norse myths that he'd been telling and retelling over and over again onto them, and they in turn were able to use their great cosmic power to reflect some of that back onto himself so that he could become the all-father that he'd always dreamed to be. This blind, lame, crippled little fellow who had very little power in ancient Norse Viking society. All he could do to empower himself was tell stories, and the ability to tell stories thereby literally empowered him and created the shining realm of Asgard as it's been in the Marvel Universe. Now, of course, this is all just Krueger and Ross's take on Odin and the Asgardians, so it's not to be regarded as canon in any way, shape, or form, but it's interesting to me, knowing the little I do about Norse mythology, that they bring back the idea of Odin as storyteller, in such a literal way. And in this story, we've got an actual storyteller who is pretty clearly supposed to be placed in the same relationship to these two youths that the actual Odin is to Thor and Loki. And so he's sitting there telling these kids these stories in the hopes of, imparting some of the wisdom of elder generation of Norsemen to them. And I gotta say, it's a really cool way to tie the contemporary Thor myths as spun in Marvel Comics back to the original format of Thor storytelling from centuries ago, i.e. oral storytelling. As we have this wizened old bard sitting there just telling these tales of Thor to these two boys in the hopes of teaching them a lesson. And the story he tells them is certainly worthy of one of the old Lee Kirby Tales of Asgard backup stories, of how Loki is always angry and jealous of Thor. One day he's so badly humiliated by Thor's shrugging off a potential practical joke that Loki was playing on him, that he actually decides to really get egg on Thor's face by going to the mystical mountain of Cragmouth, which is the home of the storms. It's where the storms go when they're not floating around in the sky and dumping rain and lightning on the landscape. He goes there and he encounters the biggest and most powerful of all storms, so powerful it's actually evolved sentience and dubbed itself the God Storm. So, Loki manages to plant the seeds of resentment, he's using his trickster wiles in the mind of the Godstorm, so that when Thor later summons the Godstorm to the aid of a valiant band of Viking warriors, the Godstorm is predisposed to be angry at being called down to rescue mere mortals from their fate, and he rebels against Thor. Thor is able to bring the Godstorm to heel and banish him to imprisonment in a cavern deep below the ocean. And there leaves him. And so the stage is set at that point, as what's past as prologue. The young lads returning to the framing sequence don't get quite the lesson out of this that the storyteller had hoped. But still, they ask questions about what became of the Godstorm after that can't help but pique the storyteller's own curiosity. So he gets out some thoroughly authentic Norse rune sticks and scatters them on the ground as kind of a device that allows him to then turn around and tell these lads a folk tale of the future. A story of Thor that won't happen for another 1,000 years after the time of the people telling and hearing it. The rune sticks tell him basically a story of Thor fighting alongside the original Avengers. How they fight this armored supervillain called the Withermaker, who's actually a disgruntled, angry little man named Jared Carstairs. He's a professional meteorologist who has a crush on one of his co-workers, and when she spurns him, he builds this suit of armor that lets him produce wither-type effects, and he kidnaps her, and the Avengers have to fight him to get her back. And the story ends up with this angry little man in prison, summoning to himself, using hidden technology of his, the biggest, most destructive storm he can find to bust him out of prison. That, of course, is the Godstorm, and the issue ends with his being possessed by the Godstorm itself. And that's kind of the cliffhanger on which the issue ends. But it's a great merging of both ancient Eddic storytelling and a couple different modes of Silver Age contemporary Thor storytelling, all in one interesting 2-issue story that's a lot of fun to read. Kurt Busiek is really having a good time with this one. I'm not going to say it's one of the best things he's ever written, but it's entertaining to be sure, and it's a fine tribute to Silver Age Marvel, which I'm always willing to read. And let us not forget Steve the Dude Rude. And his artwork is always a real trip to read, man. His art is legendary, but both in the fact that it's treating literally legendary subject matter, characters from ancient North myths, but its art is a legend unto itself. This in Kirby's centennial year here, you can't help talking up the influence Kirby had on the dude, which is fairly strong and in evidence in his work, even when he's not doing a self-conscious tribute, which is clearly what he's doing in this 2-issue miniseries. The dude's art it's Kirby. It exists at the intersection of Kirby's visual sensibilities and those of Chuck Jones. It's Kirby hopped up on ecstasy and Fruit Loops. It's Kirby with additional flexibility, fluidity, whimsy, and grace. Still nobody, not even Rude, matches Kirby for explosive creative energy and power, but it's a little more sinuous when Rude draws Kirby-style artwork. I'll give him that much. He does bring something to a Kirby-esque style that Kirby himself never quite did, and it's a satisfying combination. And Busiek, for his part, also does a pretty good job of simulating the high-flown quasi-Elizabethan speech patterns that Stan Lee introduced to the Asgardians in Thor. And he captures the feel and the style of those Silver Age stories as only a loving fan can. In fact, in some ways, he actually captures the era a little too well, i.e. His portrayal of Jane Foster. Some things are, especially in this present day when we're used to thinking of Jane Foster as the Thunder God, re-encountering this drippy, simpering, lovesick nurse version of Jane Foster, which is certainly accurate to the way she was portrayed in the comics in those days, but I guess there's such a thing as being too faithful to the source material, if you know what I mean. So that's one thing to regret about this series. But on the whole, it's really a great little series. It's a good little Thor story. It's a good story to keep in mind, not only in this Kirby Centennial year, but also in the year in which the Thor Ragnarok movie is about to be released. If the impending movie has whet your appetite for a good Thor story to read, this is one story that I happen to be able to recommend at the present time. All right, one more for the road here, Bubblistics, as we cross over enemy lines back to the DC universe, where I can make the following statement with pride, relief, and joy. This is the last time the Our Worlds at War crossover event will be mentioned on Murd's Time Bubble. Yes, that's right, I've finally come to what is the final official chapter in that sprawling interstellar saga known as the Our Worlds at War macro crossover event, which completely engulfed the DC Comics line for a couple of months here. The final chapter or tie-in out of... there's actually a little checklist on the last page of this issue, going down which I was able to count a total of 38 between bannered crossover issues of ongoing series and several special one-shots. Introduced for the purpose of furthering this particular storyline. They're spread out into 3 phases: Prelude to War, All-Out War, and Casualties of War. And the comic of which I now speak, the World's Finest Our Worlds at War one-shot. It is number 38 of 38. And that's not even counting the 7 Aftermath tie-ins that are solicited on this same checklist back page to be released in the weeks following the release of Our Worlds at War World's Finest here, which is cover dated. It's another one of the October 2001 cover dates in my little passel of comics to be reviewed here. So it was actually released more like August of 2001. So that's about when this story finally wound itself down and the DC Universe was able to enjoy peacetime once again. So, yes, it's our long national nightmare just about ended. Just in time for our nation in the real world to be plunged into a much more real and consequential nightmare. So that the timing of this whole crossover is really quite ironic, and it's a good thing that it got itself wrapped up before the events alluded to near the beginning of this podcast, because the whole thing would have seemed both inconsequential and a little disrespectful, frankly, it recontextualized in light of real-world events that followed. But anyway, well, that's neither here nor there. So what we have here, World's Finest, Our Worlds at War, a 48-page one-shot, written by Jeff Loeb, and to tell you who drew it is going to be quite an expenditure of breath on my part. I mean, it's a 48-page one-shot, and that's not taking into account the pages that are given over to advertising. It's really more like 40 pages of story, divvied up between 10 different art teams. I mean, the creator, the credits list reads like the attendees of a small convention here. So let's see. Mike Waringo and Jose Marzan Jr., Doug Monkey and Walden Wong, Phil Jimenez and Mark Morales, Mark Buckingham and Wayne Foucher, Bill Sienkiewicz, inking himself, Yvel Guichet and Dexter Vines, Pasquale Ferry and Marlo Alquiza, Todd Nauk and Larry Stucker, Duncan Rouleau, inking himself, Ed McGuinness and Cam Smith. Yeah, so there you go. 10 different art teams, each drawing about 4 pages per. Comic looks like a damn memorial quilt, all the different visual styles stitched together here. So, to all things an end, And, so let's see, the cover blurb, the cover, by the way, was drawn by that Jay Lee fella that I complimented extensively earlier on in this episode. Remember the guy who draws like J.H. Williams III, only more metal? Yeah, you've heard of Jay Lee. Sure you have. So anyway, he provided the cover, which is Superman standing in kind of a Pieta-style pose in front of a statue, a headstone, of a winged angel with a Wonder Woman symbol at its pedestal. And indeed, it's one of the many characters memorialized in this issue did indeed bear the Wonder Woman insignia, but we'll get to that. So, yeah, the front cover blurb reads, "The simple single-word requiem. The story inside is actually entitled Finale. Doesn't matter, they're pretty much equivalent and interchangeable hackneyed expressions of lazily lugubrious wannabe profundity, which is really all this one-issue story and this entire bloated crossover deserves, come down to it. So yeah, it's World's Finest, Our Worlds at War, and that title does seem, at first glance, like a little bit of a misnomer, because once you read the story inside, you find that it's mostly about Superman, who, as I said, stands alone on the front cover, Batman, not nowhere in sight. And Batman is on the inside of the story, but he spends the entire thing glued to the monitors of the Bat computer, just waiting for any word of his little pal Robin and the rest of the Young Justice team, who were lost in space in the midst of all the fighting. So Batman's kind of out of action for the story. It's really, as a microcosm for the Our Worlds at War event as a whole, it's a Superman-driven story, as indeed Our Worlds at War was a Superman-driven crossover. Superman is the one who was most personally affected by the events and the aftermath of Our Worlds at War, and he is the one who bears the burden of its continuity consequences, or the greater part of them anyway, through the weeks and months to come. He's the one who's seems to be mourning it, or even most aware that it even happened, as he carries on through his own various monthly comics across the course of the next year. I mean, this is Superman shortly before he adopted that variant costume with the yellow negative space portions of his S-shield filled in with black. Yeah, Superman was taken to kind of a dark place by the events of Our Worlds at War, and it's not just the way it affected his family, his personal life, but it was kind of something of a end of innocence for him, however temporary. The fact that he had to make a couple of deals with the devil in cooperating with President Luthor in the course of this interplanetary conflict in which Earth found itself swept up, and also the fact that the devil with whom he made a deal, in turn made a deal of his own with a still greater devil, i.e. Dark Side of Apocalypse. The whole affair just left a very dark pall hanging over Superman's mind and soul, which he externalized by adopting that red and black S-shield for about a year's worth of stories. And that all, so in this one-shot issue, you can kind of see him descending to that dark place that led to him adopting that for a while. So there are actually a lot of little things going on in this peculiar patchwork of a wrap-up. So yes, Superman, he tries to talk Batman out of the Batcave and fails. There's a couple of different groups of characters mourning over the MIA Aquaman, the Justice League, and also his former junior partner, Garth, formerly Aqualad, known at this point in time as Tempest. He's hanging out with his fellow adult Teen Titans, wondering what's next for him now that Aquaman is gone. We have some of the senior members of the JSA sitting around having a little informal wake for their lost teammate, Hippolyta, mother of Diana, and who in post-crisis, post-John Byrne run-on Wonder Woman continuity actually traveled back in time to the 1940s and became the Golden Age Wonder Woman, thus filling that particular gap in the DC timeline left by Wonder Woman, well, Earth 2 Wonder Woman not existing, for one thing, and number 2, Earth 1 Wonder Woman not entering man's world until after the formation of the Justice League, let alone after the end of World War II. So anyway, Hippolyta, who did serve as the Golden Age Wonder Woman, thanks to a little bit of time travel hoo-ha brought about by Byrne, she also snuffed it in the in the Our Worlds at War crossover, so that's acknowledged here. And we've also got Amanda Waller of Suicide Squad mourning the apparent passing of Frank Rock. Maxima, remember her? Maxima, warrior queen of the planet Almerac and a would-be suitor of Superman. She was a post-crisis introduction to the Superman supporting cast, and she also bought the farm in Our Worlds at War. We see Superman and Wonder Woman watching with horror as Mongal, the daughter of Mongol, assumes the throne of the Almeratian Empire, because she bested Maxima in single combat, and so she, by Almeratian martial law, then becomes the new monarch. So it's another unfortunate side effect of this conflict. We witness Young Justice's happy homecoming and Batman actually cracking a smile at the sight of it. And we end up with Superman and Lois attending a funeral for Lois's father, U.S. General Sam Lane, who also fell, defending the home front during this conflict. And then Superman and Lois swing by Smallville, where Superman picks up the fallen mailbox at the Kent farm. His parents are missing, presumed dead at this point in time. They would eventually turn up alive, of course, but for the time being, Superman is all tears and angst, and this very emotionally fraught moment at the very end, as Superman cries real tears, he says to his wife, Smallville, the farm, my parents, we won the war, Lois, right? We won. Yes, the ironic expression of the human cost of war, blah, 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 which again would, this kind of ridiculous modern militaristic maundering would seem like a bit of an affront to the actual casualties of an act of terrorist aggression against our nation in just about a month after this comic hit the stand. So again, I say it's a good thing that this crossover finished itself up about when it did. So, yeah, a whole crazy quilt of different stuff happening here. None of it really very sincere or, in the long run, consequential, as I've said a couple of times already. You really have to wonder if Jeff Loeb could even bring himself to write all of these scenes of grief and funeral observances with a straight face, because most of these characters are going to be coming back. I mean, I've already tipped my hand as far as Ma and Pa Kent turning up alive some months down the line. Frank Rock, he showed up again in the Suicide Squad series that I think I mentioned last time I recorded one of these things. Aquaman, of course, he came back in the Justice League Obsidian Age storyline, which I'll probably be commenting on in this podcast in episodes to come. Maxima, I'm pretty sure, did stay dead, at least up until Flashpoint. And post-Flashpoint, a new version of Maxima is flying around, and that's legit. But honestly, I think for me at least, the most genuinely emotionally affecting scene, probably beyond the intention of the creators of this comic, is one of the many funeral observance type scenes that I've mentioned. There's a little scene where Superman and Wonder Woman attend the memorial service scheduled at the Strange Visitor Memorial in Smallville, where a large statue of purple stone has been erected in the ruins of Kansas was hit pretty hard by the fallout of the Our Worlds at War conflict, all the astronautical dogfights going on outside Earth's atmosphere. Kansas got hit pretty hard. And so Smallville is kind of in ruins. I mentioned that Clark Kent's parents are missing. Apparently Smallville was also the hometown of a lady named Sharon Vance. Okay, she's kind of a forgotten footnote of late 90s, early 2000s Superman continuity. But Sharon Vance, after Superman shed his electric blue power set that he had for that wild and crazy year or two in the late 90s when he had them. In 1998, just in time for the 60th anniversary of the first appearance of Superman, of course, the big Superman Forever one-shot with the lenticular Alex Ross cover. I'm sure some of you remember it. Those electric blue superpowers of his they were presented to him by a character called Kismet, who something like being what to the DC universe what eternity is to the Marvel universe. She's kind of a personification of the DC cosmos, but she's got an origin story that's a bit like Galactus in that she was originally a more or less human being residing in a parallel dimension who was chosen to act as the animistic celestial embodiment of the DC universe. She was the one who was responsible somehow for Superman gaining these powers, and she had to see to it that they found another wielder. So she brought in this lady named Sharon Vance, who apparently was also a Smallville native, and she then gained these electric blue powers that Superman used to have, teamed up with Superman, using them a couple of times under the name of Strange Visitor. So it's just sort of a spin-off, to Superman, what the Slingers, remember them, were to Spider-Man back around the same time in the late 90s, taking this sort of alternate identity or persona or power set that was temporarily foisted on an established character and then spinning it off and bestowing it on a new character, hoping to generate some interest in readers that way. In the case of Strange Visitor, it absolutely failed. So she, however, sacrificed herself heroically, fighting alongside Superman in outer space against the forces of the big bad Imperiex in the Our Worlds at War story. And there was... the story in which she died was actually fairly creative storytelling, I thought. I may or may not have mentioned it on the Time Bubble in the past. If I didn't, I should have. In which she's sort of mind melds with Superman, and she and also Kismet, speaking through her swiftly dissipating consciousness, both of them as one. They sort of meld with one another and then form a Vulcan mind merge or whatever with Superman so that Sharon's final thoughts can be conveyed to Superman and also granted further cosmic context and dignity by Kismet speaking through her. Let Superman know what's happening and ask him to carry her best to her loved ones back on Earth and what have you. And so she expired helping to protect Earth, and it did affect Superman somewhat, and so he at least has the decency to come, bringing a date, as it were, in Wonder Woman, who I don't think ever even met Strange Visitor, to the Strange Visitor Memorial, this big purple sculpture, sort of an abstract image of a woman's form in Smallville. And the only other person that bothers to show up for the memorial for this minor character is a person named Billy. And there's a very sort of tragic meta level to all of this that I kind of think Grant Morrison, just to drop his name one more time in this episode, might have appreciated. Because it's a memorial statue and a memorial service for a character that I think we could all guess, even at the time we were first reading this comic in the fall of 2001, would absolutely not on any level be remembered, much less resurrected, as most of the other characters immortalized in this issue would. You sort of knew that Strange Visitor was gone forever and shuffled off to that sort of ghetto-like limbo for out-of-use characters that Grant Morrison introduced us to in his Animal Man run. You can sort of picture Strange Visitor sitting on a curb drinking a 40 in that place right now. And hanging out there is a character who was of some importance to her. His name is Billy. He's a young man who I guess is an artist. He's probably responsible for the sculpture. I don't know whether he was Sharon Vance's boyfriend or brother or what, but he's sitting there, and he's the only one other than Superman and Wonder Woman who bothered to show up to pay homage to this woman who sacrificed herself during this big conflagration to save Earth. And he just kind of lays into Superman and Wonder Woman, demanding to know why Superman couldn't save her sister, and telling them, I don't give a damn if she died every inch a hero. She's gone, and maybe if one of you lost someone you cared about, you'd have the slightest idea of what I'm talking about. The irony, well, the surface-level irony of what he's saying being, of course, that both Superman and Wonder Woman did lose parents in this conflict. Hippolyta and Ma and Pa Kent are both gone, but in neither case for good. Hippolyta, too, of course, would turn up alive later on. And the last words that Billy says to Superman and Wonder Woman, here's where things get interesting. He's reaming them out, and all you can see of him in that panel, the last one where he speaks his last words in any comic book ever, basically, all you can see of him is one hand extending from his sleeves, pointed accusatorily at Superman and Wonder Woman as he chews them out. And That's it. You don't even see him stalking off angrily. You don't see him walking away. In that panel, he's only half present. All you see of him is his hand pointing. And then the next instant, it's like he's fading out of continuity and into that same limbo to which Strange Visitor has already been banished, even as he's speaking. So, you really feel, again, on the meta level, the subtext here is that she is, the really tragic thing is, she's not only dead, but she's never coming back because she was such an unimportant character that no one's ever going to bother to revive her. This really is the last we'll see of her, and that memorial statue makes it even more tragic because we, as readers, from our position outside of DC continuity and reality, are fully aware that the next time we see Smallville, they'll probably have hurried along the reconstruction efforts and swept this whole Our World's at War thing completely under the carpet in a couple of months' time, and next thing you know, Potter's General Store will be open again, the Smallville Crows will be playing for the playoffs, and they will never show this purple stone statue erected to the memory of this completely forgettable supporting character ever again. And poor Billy, he's even worse off than Strange Visitor because he doesn't even have a costume or powers to make him interesting to anyone. He's a supporting character for a supporting character that nobody really cared that much about to begin with. So, his bitterness and resentment, the intense grief he's feeling not only for the loss of Sharon Vance, but for the loss of his own relevance and his own ontological anchor in the DC universe, it's very sharply felt by him, and you can sort of feel it in the bile and verjuice that he's spewing at Wonder Woman and Superman in this scene. I've spread more verbiage now over this little minor scene in this little minor comic about these little minor characters than anybody else in the entire Phanosphere has ever bothered to, I'm quite sure, but still, it's the one part of this comic that really struck a chord with me, I have to say. The rest of it is all just kind of maudlin, somewhat cynical nonsense. Like I said, I can't believe that Jeff Loeb himself could really take any of it seriously, even as he was writing it, but bless him for trying. And the narrative device that he employed, just to lay it on even thicker than he needed to, throughout the course of the entire issue, he's interspersing sequential excerpts taken from General MacArthur's farewell speech to Congress in April of 1951. And it just does not work. I mean, any parallelism between the different excerpts he semi-strategically positions throughout the story and what's actually happening in the story on the page is inorganic and forced at best and completely non-existent and nonsensical at worst. It's a clunky, distracting, overblown device. It's a failed attempt on Loeb's part to stuff some class, some military-flavored gravitas and dignity into this turkey of an event wrap-up issue. It's kind of a clunker. The whole story was, there are one or two scenes. So there's some really talented artists working in this issue, sure. So it's kind of worth flipping through it at least to see that. And it only cost $2.95 at that time, and just to give you an idea of what kind of inflation we've been experiencing over the past decade and a half, a 48-page comic only set you back $2.95 in those days. Doesn't seem like too much to pay to experience a couple pages of the work of all these good artists, and also to get a little bit of closure from this bomb of a story to which we've all been forcibly exposed for the past several months of DC Comics. But anyway, I think I've, to use an Eberlian term, shot my bolt on this whole thing. I promise you now, we can put this to bed, even though there are still 7 aftermath tie-in issues still waiting in the wings after the publication of this comic in August of 2001. You have my word as a gentleman, I will not bring up any of them on future episodes of The Time Bubble. It is done. All done with. Ashes to ashes. Amen and amen. All right, so to bring us out on a high note, how about I just share with you a few little tiny bubbles here, a couple really quick mentions of a few other worthy comics that I had in my red pile to mention to you. Remember that Peter David written run on Supergirl in the 90s into the early 2000s? Well, here's issue number 62 of that run, featuring, on the cover, guest villain Two-Face, encountering Supergirl as she makes a tour throughout the DC Universe, visiting various cities. Obviously, Gotham is next on her itinerary. And it's also the introduction of Bizarro Supergirl, whose creation was funded by Two-Face, actually, with a little help from Supergirl's old pal, the fallen demon Buzz. So, yes, we've got a Bizarro Supergirl in this issue. And this Supergirl series, to give it one more plug, it really, if it can penetrate the extremely dense continuity surrounding the central character, there were some really well-told stories in that run. It got awfully confusing at times, but there were nuggets of gold to pick up along the way. And if you'd like to see what I'm talking about, I might as well mention DC, to my great surprise, actually, is beginning to collect this run in trades. Now, never mind the impenetrability and the prerequisite necessary knowledge of Supergirl's place in post-crisis pre-Flashpoint continuity necessary in able to understand what's going on, but it seems to me that DC's maybe just reprinting and trading any and all Supergirl material they can get their grubby little hands on, just to sort of exploit the popularity of the Supergirl TV series, though row help the casual Supergirl TV show watcher who picks up a trade of that and expects to find anything in it that it bears any resemblance to what they're seeing on the CW on Monday nights. So, I sort of question the wisdom of publishing that material as a tie-in to the TV show, but as I've said several times, it's actually some fairly quality storytelling if you feel brave enough to give it a shot. So it's available in trade form again, thanks to DC right now. Next, I've got number 9 of the Kurt Busiek and Eric Larson Defenders run. And this is the issue in which the Headmen, yes, the Headmen, that odd assortment of revived 1950s Atlas-era horror characters, actually succeeds in taking over the world with the help of another 1950s Atlas-era horror monster character, the omnipotent Orgo, who acts as their genie out of the bottle and aids the Headmen in actually conquering the world. Has to be seen to be believed. Then I've got issue number 61 of Superman Adventures, the ongoing series based on the Kids WB at that time, Superman animated series, written by Andy Merrill, whom you may remember as the voice of Brack from Space Ghost Coast to Coast, and later The Brack Show, who also did turn in some TV scripts and comic scripts from time to time. He wrote a couple of episodes of the Crypto the Superdog cartoon, in fact. And he wrote this issue of the Superman Adventures, which has Superman battling the Parasite, and it also introduces to the DC animated universe the classic Golden Age Superman supporting characters, Hocus and Pocus Magicians by Accident. Oh, it's a fun little story with kind of a Golden Age flavor, and it's got Andy Merrill's unmistakable flair for eccentric wordplay. Yeah, good story. Then, JSA, number 28, Jeff Johns and Steven Sadowski. This is the issue in which several issues of the JSA find themselves captives of the lethal roulette, forced to battle each other to the death in gladiatorial-style combat for the amusement of an audience of supervillains and mercenaries in Roulette's private arena, The House. Yeah, she's become a fairly well-known character, too. She had a guest appearance on the Supergirl TV show a little while ago. So she's Roulette is splayed across the front cover of this issue with the caption, "Roulette, where she stops, nobody knows." Okay, it's a little sleazy, but what the heck, it was 2001. And finally, the fifth issue of the miniseries JLA Incarnations by John Ostrander. It's bannered a special Crisis crossover. It focuses on the Detroit Bunker-era Justice League, which was the Justice League, in effect, during the time of the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it's one of few stories to take an unflinching look at the Crisis on Infinite Earths event and its place in continuity after its own continuity-altering effects have fully taken root. So in other words, it shows you a closer look than ever seen before, I think, at what the heroes and villains of the DC Universe were fighting for and about if they weren't actually fighting to save a multiverse that retroactively had never existed. Confused? You probably should be. Yeah, this is an issue that Peter Rios and I will probably be talking about at some episode of The Crisis Tapes to be recorded in the far, far, far future, given the 2-episode-a-year pace we're generally going in producing that podcast nowadays. But we'll probably talk about this as an important latter-day, after-the-fact crisis retcon tie-in type thing. So, yep, as a crisisologist, that was an issue that I was happy to own and read, and I'm happy to mention in passing to you right now. And speaking of passing, I believe that our time together for this installment of the Time Bubble has effectively passed. So, I thank you all for joining me once again on this voyage. I hope you've all reached your destination in another week of Comic Geek Speak content to enjoy, safe and sound. And if this vehicle needs to be pressed into service for emergency evac again, I look forward to the opportunity to serving in that capacity. Hope you all have enjoyed what I've had to say about these comics from late 2001. Be back with more of the same sometime in the next calendar year, shall we say. Call it a date. As always, I encourage all of you listening, if you are so inclined, to visit thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com to drop little mentions or feedback about this episode and the comics that I've discussed therein at the forum talkback thread that will be emerging there in the very near future. I always like to hear what you guys have to say about the things that I have to say. It does help me to fine-tune my delivery on this podcast from episode to episode. I thank you once again for your patronage and your patience, and I will return to entertain and enlighten you once more with my temerarious tales of comics of decades past when I am with you next time.